Like a lot of newer players, my first Monster Hunter game was Monster Hunter World. At a friend's insistence, I decided to give it a try and downloaded the demo before the game's full release. I played the missions they had available, with the last one being up against an Anjanath. I beat the Anjanath fairly quickly, and then I did it again in multiplayer to see what it was like to play with other people. The experience was okay. But I am not a man that is satisfied with just okay. Like many adult players, I have to allocate my time wisely. Free time is precious, after all. I don't want to play okay games. I want to play really good ones. This gameplay was just not clicking, and there was nothing about playing with other people that made the experience any more enjoyable. The demo passed, and I was sure I wasn't going to get the full game. But then the demo came out again, this time with a new monster. Once again, my friend pestered me, and I decided to give the game another shot. Now, I obviously eventually changed my mind and got the game. Why? Well, that's simple. Because when I tried to fight Nergigante, I got fucking smashed. Over and over. I couldn't beat it. Clearly, I thought, this was meant to be played as a group. There's no way they expect me to fight this thing alone. So I joined a random group's game and tried again. That did not help. If anything, it just made the fight harder. The lack of coordination and how varied a random team's abilities are just added a lot of unnecessary variance to the results. Having more people was just not helping. Nergigante could cart everyone with one dive attack. I could have just stopped playing, but this thing had done something to my brain. I was determined to beat it. But with this being a demo, I had no way of doing the things that a player might normally do to overcome an obstacle. I couldn't farm for materials. I couldn't just go find better players to help, because everyone was struggling. The only option available to me was get good. Now, over the course of this process, I had steadily gotten better at using the longsword. I started understanding how the foresight slash worked and how to time it. I decided to go solo and practice with my weapon of choice. For the next few hours, I walked the path to mastery by charging straight at this brick wall. The experience was awesome. It felt like me and the monster were dancing. I had never experienced this kind of gameplay. It required you to learn the ins and outs of your weapon, and then learn the monster's moveset so well that you developed a personal relationship with it. It was really amazing. The closest thing to it would probably be Midir from Dark Souls 3. But even Midir was nowhere near this hard. Incidentally, Midir is one of my favorite bosses from Dark Souls. Eventually I did solo Nergigante, and I did buy the full game. My point is this. I love Monster Hunter World. Over the course of World's life cycle, I poured so many hours into the game that I am almost ashamed to show you how many. I hunted every new monster released, and my favorites were always the very hardest ones. So I want you to know that when I criticize the game, as I am about to, it's not because I don't like the game, or I don't understand what's good about it. My complaints come from a place of love, and a desire to have this series be as good as it can be. So all of that said, I think Monster Hunter World had serious problems. I'm going to try and detail the most glaring ones, and why I think Rise will address most, if not all, of those problems. Let's start with my minor issues before we get to the big one. Monster Hunter World had a design philosophy focused on maintaining a certain level of realism, more so than previous games at least. The effects of this philosophy are present in everything: the weapons, the armor, monster designs, the layout of Astera, and even the ecosystems. While there's nothing wrong with dedication to realism, how it's implemented in World has sometimes led the developers to make bad design choices, mostly in the weapons. The weapons in Monster Hunter World look like garbage. There are a few weapons that look okay, but in most of those instances you find that the best looking weapons are the ones that kept their original design from previous games. Monster Hunter is a game where you hunt progressively stronger monsters and use their materials to make stronger and stronger weapons. The power of your weapons is supposed to come from the monsters. So explain to me this abomination. This is a normal ore weapon with some monster fluff added to the hilt. A huge number of the weapons are like this, where they just have the normal iron or bone design and slap on some feathers or scales or somewhere. I am just going to assume that the reason for these unfortunate choices wasn't laziness, but rather that they wanted World to be more realistic than their previous titles. The designs for weapons of returning monsters from World, in Rise, will retain their original appearance. Here you can see a hunter with Kulayaku's Insectglaive and armor. The decision to keep the design for World weapons unchanged is probably more of a respect thing than laziness. The team that worked on World is not the same one that worked on Rise, and the two teams worked at the same time and shared ideas. The Japanese are a polite people. It's not unreasonable to suspect that they could be viewed as bad form to change the weapon designs another team worked on just a couple of years before. It's like saying, your weapon designs are shit, and I'm not going to use them. It would be true, of course, but still, probably too rude a thing to do. Well, fine. But thankfully, Monster Hunter Rise has no mandate to continue making iron and bone weapons for new monsters. From what has been shown so far, I think we have good reason to believe ugly weapons are a thing of the past. Every weapon in the demo has been unique, and its design reflects the monster it's based on. They all look great, but my favorite so far is the Charge Blade. It looks particularly nice when it uses counter-peak performance. I like the way that the sides of the shield extend to better absorb the impact of the coming attack. Let's move on to a related complaint: the atmosphere. Every Monster Hunter title is trying to capture a certain feeling. In World, you are explorers and innovators. You cross the ocean and are in a new land with new monsters. Astera bustles with a feeling of constant, excited industriousness. This feeling of freshness and energy isn't limited to the game world. Monster Hunter has been exclusively a handheld game for a long time, and this was the first time it had access to this kind of power. It was a new world for developers and players alike. When paired together with World's emphasis on more realism, you get atmosphere and graphics that look like this. Now, my complaint here really isn't a complaint, because in fact this whole thing it's going for works very well most of the time. But when I was waiting for the game to release after getting hooked on the demo, I stumbled across a video of an Atal Ka hunt for Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. Atal Ka is the coolest monster I have ever seen. The original Wirebug, and first master of the Silkbind attack. This Egyptian-themed mantis spider uses its silk to manipulate objects in the environment, and uses them like tools against the hunter. Now that's cool on its own, but soon after I started the video I see this thing pull up a bunch of metal from under the sand, bind it together with its silk into the shape of a dragon, and then it pilots it from the inside, manipulating it with its thread. It was fucking amazing. Over the course of the fight, Atal Ka's silk permeated the battlefield more and more. It slung old Dragonators at the hunter, and it even pulled out a metal wheel which it used to fly around and run them over. It was glorious. And sadly, it was not something World was ever going to do. This over-the-top, bombastic style of monster was exactly the kind of thing they were trying to get away from in World. That's fine, of course. World was trying to be its own thing, and it had a theme to adhere to, which sometimes means embracing those kinds of limitations. But Rise has no such limitations. The entire aesthetic is decidedly Japanese, and the monsters themselves have yokai motifs they are based on. Realism is surely still an aspect to consider when designing the monsters, but from what we've seen so far, it's an aspect that takes a back seat to style. This liberation from the tyranny of realism allows Rise to have more elements of the fantastical, and it shows. Not just on the weapons and the enemies, the very world itself is brimming with color. Some people will view the new graphics as a downgrade, but I think the environments and characters look gorgeous, and exactly the direction this new Monster Hunter needed to go. Now finally, let me address the biggest problem with Monster Hunter World. But first, let me say goodbye to the many subscribers I will surely lose. I hardly knew ye, and I am really sorry to see you go. Monster Hunter World has a shit story. It's not good, it's not decent, it's not average, it's not serviceable. It's bad. And it doesn't even have the decency to be bad in a normal way. It spends so much of its time pretending to have a point, only to go nowhere. Let me give you some examples. In the base game, you are tracking Zora Magdaros while you try and figure out where it's trying to go. You try and capture it in the Great Ravine, but your efforts are thwarted by Nergigante. Now at the time it seemed to me that Nergi was trying to help Zora Magdaros. It looked like it was trying to remove the binders and fighting off the hunters in an attempt to get Zora Magdaros where it was trying to go. Since the beginning, the game tries to give Zora Magdaros and Nergigante an air of mystery. So I thought the idea that they'd be working together wasn't that far-fetched. But it turns out no. It wants to eat Zora Magdaros. Even if I suspend my disbelief at whether Nergigante could even feasibly do something like that, it's just such a stupid justification that it ruins all the weird build-up around them. World does this kind of thing over and over. It takes itself so seriously and pretends like it's developing some overarching central theme and that a big reveal is upcoming. But the actual justification is always either ignored or it's just stupid. One of the worst times this happened was at the release of Elatrion in Iceborne. Once defeated, the handler talks about possible reasons why Elatrion would show up in Safi'jiiva's home, and the possible connection between the two. The interaction led me to believe that something really cool was about to happen. I thought that Safi'jiiva was still luring Elder Dragons to itself, and had lured Elatrion. I thought that now that we've killed it, it would turn out Safi was not completely dead, and would absorb Elatrion's bioenergy, changing its form and becoming the next Black Dragon. I think that would have been awesome. And while I was actually really pleased when Fatalis was released, it didn't have anything to do with the previous foreshadowing. It went nowhere. Therein lies my main complaint. World is always trying to convince me that it's about to say something meaningful, or deep, or at least interesting, and it never delivers. There's nothing interesting or thematically important about the handler having Velkhana's scale. The Wyverian Hunter isn't deep or mysterious. He's edgy in the worst way, and he hasn't made any more progress in the investigation than the rest of the Commission. And at the end of the game, the story sits there with a smug look on its face, like it's revealed some fundamental truth, when in fact it has only revealed how much of a dumbass I am for expecting more. I really want to make sure you're understanding what my criticism is. I know a lot of Monster Hunter players don't care about the story. I know a lot of this is actually my own fault. I came expecting lore and minimalist storytelling like in, say, Dark Souls, and I read more into things than I should have. Okay, fine. But World led me on. I was catfished. It wouldn't have been a problem if the game was just honest about what it was. And I know that this is an issue unique to World, because I went back and played Generations Ultimate, and it did not have this problem. Generations Ultimate also had a very scarce story, but it didn't adopt the demeanor of someone quoting Milton or Shakespeare. The story was simple and charming, and never tried to pretend like it was slowly expounding on a core philosophy. Because the game made it clear that I was just there to bonk monsters, I even developed an appreciation for what little story there was. I thought it was really neat how the young Wyverian researcher retrofitted the airship to be able to pursue Valstrax, and even defied his superiors to continue that pursuit. It was easy to get into the atmosphere and just enjoy the game. The story was even more sparse than it was in World, but as a result, it was nowhere near as bad. I think I probably know why Monster Hunter World went with this style of storytelling. I suspect it has to do with the fact that they were developing with the idea that they had to try to appeal to the Western market with this title. Previous Monster Hunter titles had always struggled in the West. They saw World as an opportunity to finally break into that market in a big way. I feel they thought Western players needed this very serious tone to keep them entertained long enough to get hooked on the excellent gameplay. And they may have been right. World's success does speak for itself. It is, after all, their best-selling title of all time. Given that, it's quite possible that Rise goes the same route. But there is a couple reasons why I think they won't. You see, to address my complaints, Rise would have to do one of two things. It could revert to an older style of narrative that took itself less seriously and let most of the enjoyment come from the atmosphere, or it could simply make its story better. I think there's a lot to suggest that they're going to do both. I'm not the only person who's noticed that from at least a visual perspective, Rise is very much in the spirit of the older games. I don't think that's an accident. Like I mentioned earlier, this team is not the same one that made World. This is the portable team, responsible for some of the less serious, most over-the-top monsters, like Valstrex and Atal-Ka. By the way, I would question the sanity of these people if they don't add Atal-Ka to Rise and have it silk-bind another monster to battle us. It would be such a wasted opportunity, my god. But as I was saying, there is some significant percentage of players who played many of the older games but didn't buy World. For some, the reason is that they really like playing on their portable consoles. When you take into account the fact that it's the portable team developing the game, and the fact that the game is releasing on the Switch, and the massive popularity of the Switch in Japan, I don't think it's too much to assume that Capcom is trying to court their core Japanese audience by returning to its roots somewhat. Now, that's no guarantee that the story will be any better, but it is reason to believe that it won't have many of those elements that irked me so much. That said, maybe the story will be better. Everything I've seen so far has been quite impressive. Honestly, they've sold me on the atmosphere alone. Everything I've seen in the trailers has hit all the right notes for me. The music, the movement, the wire bugs, the village, the levels, and the tone they're trying to set. My expectations are as high as they can be, and I really just don't see myself being disappointed. And that's the end of my rant. For anybody who I haven't alienated yet, I'm sure I'll get to you in a future video. But for now, thank you for listening, and happy hunting.